We've spent the last week looking at just where federal tax dollars go in the Sunshine State and the debate over how they're spent.
Taxpayer.
Taxes.
Taxes.
Taxes. Taxes.
Taxpayer.
Ever wonder where your tax dollars go?
$247 billion of taxpayer money was wasted in 2022.
Well, I did too, especially since it seems like we're always broke as a nation. Now, it did take a lot of time and a lot of digging, but boy did I make a boatload of interesting discoveries.
I'm angry. I am angry what's happening in Washington. We are headed for socialism and fascism, Marxism.
We the people are losing control of our government and the government spending.
You will not believe all the many ridiculous ways the US government spends our money, from $400 million bridges that lead absolutely nowhere to gay bombs.
In the long history of war, it may have been one of the craziest, downright laughable ideas.
Military leaders once proposed building a so-called gay bomb.
A so-called gay bomb.
I swear to God, the gay bomb thing isn't a joke. I know you're eager to find out more about this madness, but I plan to really get you pissed off over the next several minutes. Maybe that way we can finally do something about the way our government wastes our money. So to start off, you're going to learn how government spending works.
Once a time, not that long ago, when the size of the national debt dominated political conversation.
The federal debt load snowballing in recent months, adding about $1 trillion every 100 days and currently sitting near $34.5 trillion in total.
So, like any government, a lot of the federal government's budget will go into stuff that helps the economy and serves people. I'm talking about things like Social Security, Medicare, building, construction, education, defense, etc. We call this mandatory spending, and it takes up about half the budget, as it should. I mean, it's not like the government does a good job of making sure that the hundreds of billions allocated to these sectors are even well accounted for. It's a freaking carnival how money goes missing in these places, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In the meantime, another aspect of government spending is called discretionary spending. This is the money that Congress sets aside just in case. Yeah, it sounds shady as heck, but discretionary spending is actually important. It's where FEMA gets money to cater to disasters when they happen. So it's just as important as mandatory spending, and it takes up about a third of the budget. But also, you were right, discretionary spending has become shady as heck because of this invention of Satan known as earmarks. Earmarks pretty much only exist to serve as a slush fund for these fat cats up in Congress, and nothing more. How else do you explain one senator with over $600 million in earmarks to his credit? How did he manage to do that? We'll get to that soon. The third aspect of government spending that many people don't know, or probably just forget about, is federal debt. America might be one of the best economies in the world, but she's receiving this award standing on a giant pile of cash made possible by borrowing. And the laws of economics are not about to change just because you're the land of the free and the home of the brave. No, and you're going to pay with interest. And America has borrowed so much that interest on government debt alone takes up about 10% of the budget. Now, if the government spends more than it makes, then we have a budget deficit, which, of course, has pretty much never not happened. But if the government spends less than it makes, then we have a budget surplus, and surprise, surprise, this happens only once in a pink sun in the US of A. The last time we had a budget surplus was in the Clinton era, but of course this didn't last, and once Clinton left, we were back to deficit galore. In fact, America's national debt just unlocked a new level recently.
Congress gets set to fight over funding this month. U.S. national debt just passed $34 trillion. The U.S. Treasury making the announcement just today.
Interestingly, neither Trump nor Harris are saying anything about this in their campaign trails. So I guess America will be redefining what it means to fall to rock bottom in the coming years, which isn't worrying at all. And to be clear, debt does not always have to be a bad thing. In fact, you need some level of debt as a nation if you want to grow economically. The problem with the US, however, is that our debt is growing way too fast, especially because we keep spending more than we earn on the most unbelievably frivolous things, like researching anal prints. I'm not even kidding. But as the video title says, it's government spending, but it gets increasingly ridiculous. So let's begin with this interesting thing called earmarks.
There's something else making a comeback too, the earmark, an object both relished and reviled that benefits constituents back home.
The use and the number of earmarks skyrocket.
The Teapot Museum, the Cornhusker
kickback.
The U.S. senator accused of wasting millions of dollars through earmarks.
So basically, an earmark is money that's been designated for a particular project.
Today I'm announcing that the Senate Appropriations Committee will again accept requests for congressionally directed spending items.
When a member of Congress inserts a line saying, here's a certain amount of money that's going to go to a specific project, usually in that legislator's district, that's an earmark.
It's pretty much just a water slide into waste and fraud for members of Congress. But proponents of earmarks, not surprisingly congressmen and women themselves, claim that earmarks are important to help them fight for the interests of their constituents in a transparent way.
I was always proud of my earmarks. I believe in earmarks.
Our country needs to be tied together more closely in transportation than ever before.
Aw, how sweet. Okay, so why don't we make our way down to these constituencies and see the many amazing things these altruistic men and women have been able to accomplish, from least impressive to most impressive. First, we've got House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, America's best insider trader.
Should members of Congress and their spouses be banned from trading individual stocks while serving in Congress?
We have a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that.
In 10 years, she earmarked a whopping $50 million for a light rail project to link Union Square and Chinatown with other areas of San Francisco. Sure, her husband owns a commercial building right by Union Square, but I'm sure Nancy's passion for efficient transportation in San Francisco had nothing to do with that. Next, we've got House Appropriations Committee ranking member Kay Granger.
State and city leaders today celebrated a decision that will finally help finish rerouting the Trinity River right near downtown Fort Worth.
Between 2008 and 2010, Granger channeled $52 million to reroute the Trinity River in downtown Fort Worth. But that probably has nothing to do with the condo building project she and her son were constructing just half a mile away. But $50 million? Come on, that's child's play. It's time to get serious. When we talk about the grandfather of all earmarks, it just has to be Richard Shelby, Senate Appropriations Committee ranking member. Shelby's numbers are staggering.
Mr. Shelby, who has a fine conservative record down through the years, his status as the league leader and most valuable player of the Earmarks World Series.
In just 2 years between 2008 and 2010, Shelby earmarked more than $250 million for projects owned by his former staff members, including a whopping $175 million for the University of Alabama system. Wonder why there's a Shelby everything on Alabama campuses? Yep, now you know why. But even that is still child's play, because in 2022, Shelby beat his own record, snagging 16 earmarks worth close to $650 million. That's $270 million more than his closest contender, Brian Mast, who managed to heap 6 earmarks worth a total of $377 million. In fact, altogether, just the top 5 biggest earmark accumulators in Congress raked in over $2 billion. Just the top 5, spending money we don't have on their little projects. And even that $2 billion was barely 11% of the total earmarks for the year of 2022. So in other news, America spent $20 billion plus of taxpayer money on earmarks. For perspective, you'd need 2,740 years to finish spending $1 billion. That is at the rate of $1,000 per day. But of course, it gets more ridiculous than this, so let's talk now about the monumental waste in healthcare. Yes, Americans deserve quality healthcare, and that costs money. But $15,000 per person, which is what America currently spends, is just ridiculous beyond words. That's freaking $5 trillion on healthcare spending alone. And I don't know about you, but I wake up feeling more like I've been run over by a Mack truck than like $1 million. Wanna know why? It's because a huge amount of that money doesn't even get spent on Americans. Nope, in a legendary act of mismanagement, the US government somehow manages to just lose money. I guess that's what happens when you have access to an endless supply of cash you didn't even work for. In 2023 alone, the Government Accountability Office discovered that your government racked up a whopping $236 billion in improper payments. Now get this, 74% of this staggering sum was spent on, wait for it, overpayments. Yeah, we're sinking in debt, but we're still somehow able to send money to dead people. But don't think this is even a recent development, not at all in fact. Over the last couple of decades alone, the US mistakenly doled out nearly $3 trillion in incorrect payments. Yep, you heard right, trillion, with a T. It's almost impossible to believe that these so-called improper payments were actually mistakes. Because how do you keep making improper payments year after year after year, and yet you never make an attempt to try and correct it? has to be intentional, but in a move only legends can pull off, the US is, once again, nowhere close to reaching the height of ridiculousness in the world of ridiculous spending. If you don't already know that the Pentagon is a literal waste machine, well, good morning to you. Between 2000 and 2010 alone, the Pentagon wasted $46 billion on loads and loads of ineffective weapons, including the Future Combat Systems program, so-called networked high-tech vehicles that never worked, the Comanche helicopter that was never built even after 22 years of development, and a 40-ton Crusader artillery gun that never even made it to the prototype phase. How about the M1 Abrams heavy tank? Here's one in Iraq if you've never seen it. As you can see, it's huge. It's massive, but it's also really big for nothing. Military officials themselves have said that they hardly ever need a 70-ton tank, even when fighting insurgents up close. They've begged and pleaded with Congress to stop funding the manufacturing of these white elephant tanks, but someone probably told Congress that when the DoD says yes, they really mean no. Because even though the US has just one tank manufacturing factory left, it's in Lima, Ohio, by the way, and even though this factory has laid off numerous workers and watched its production slow to a trickle, Congress continues to allocate funding for the production of more M1 Abrams. At this point, one has to wonder if there's a superhuman race of enemies coming for the US that only the government knows about. In the Trump administration, funding for the Abrams skyrocketed because domestic manufacturing resurgence. This is in spite of the fact that since 2012, the Army has been crying that they desperately need to save money. All that was left for then Army Chief of Staff General Ray Odierno to bawl his eyes out to Congress and beg them to keep the money for the tanks. And still, Congress kept sending more. That same year, Congress slapped Odierno and his boys with $183 million for more tanks. By 2019, that money had ballooned to $1.5 billion, giving Joint Systems Manufacturing Centers enough Franklins to hire up to 1,000 more employees and roll out 34 brand new Abrams every single month. I don't even... And how about the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the DoD's most expensive weapons program of all time? Over the course of its lifetime, this guy's going to cost Americans a whopping $1.5 trillion. Now for some backstory. The first F-35 prototype flew like some 2 decades back, and then after that, about 490 F-35s were built. But it's been flaw after flaw since then, defect after defect, to the point where half of the 490 had to be grounded in 2017 and 2018 for maintenance. But guess who's set to buy 2,400 more F-35s in the coming years? You guessed it. But if you think the Abrams and F-35s are the only ridiculous expenses that the Pentagon has to offer, you're joking. From the stables of the department that brought you $640 toilet seats and $7,600 coffee pots, I present to you Zumwalt Destroyer, a $22 billion warship, useless for all intents and purposes, a $30 billion Littoral combat ship, also useless for all intents and purposes, a $43 billion KC-46 refueling tanker, which is hardly any better than the refuelers the Army currently uses. And we haven't even begun to talk about administrative costs. Needless and redundant paperwork in the Pentagon is making Americans bleed hundreds of billions. And still, the US hasn't wasted all that it can waste. Have you seen how much the federal government pumps into overseas wars?
We will defeat the enemy and win the war on terror.
Afghans will take full responsibility for their security, and our combat mission will be over.
The results of several years of reporting and legal pursuit of government documents.
Since 9/11, the US government has shilled a mind-numbing $8 trillion on wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other countries. Yep, $8 trillion. And that's not even including the cost of war to the US economy, interest on war debt, and the local costs of war. That's just money spent on foreign wars. And, of course, America is not that rich, so all this money is coming from, you guessed it, borrowing. America has borrowed so much to fund foreign wars that interest payments could hit $6.5 trillion by the 2050s. And yes, once again, I'm still talking trillion with a T. Now, want to know what exactly those trillions of dollars were used for? Let's have a look. We spent $549 million on a fleet of cargo planes for Afghanistan's Air Force, and then after a year, we sold the entire fleet for scrap for $40,000. We shelled out $85 million to build a posh hotel next to the US Embassy in Kabul. That hotel is now a ruin. It wasn't even opened in the first place. The government also burned $36 million on a supposed control center in the desert of Helmand. development. Didn't matter that the Marines said they didn't need it in the first place. Another $249 million went into building a road that ended up not being even half built. Then, every day, we spent $1.5 million supposedly fighting the production of opium in Afghanistan. And here's the weird part. Rather than go down or perhaps stay stagnant, opium production in Afghanistan after America's intervention only kept going up. This math isn't mathing. Was the US government fighting or investing? I've said too much. Anyway, I could go on and on. There's the $19 billion that didn't even go into useless projects. This money just went down the drain of fraud and abuse. And you know what makes this whole thing so messed up? For instance, the US sank $2 trillion into Afghanistan. Still, the US Army suffered a humiliating defeat, eventually fleeing Afghanistan and leaving the people to the mercy of the Taliban. And it's not even just that. Because the US military wasted and mismanaged a huge part of the $2 trillion budget, Afghans are still suffering today, with 90% living on under $2 a day. But believe me, government spending gets even more ridiculous. Ever heard of the $400 million bridge that literally led nowhere?
I told Congress thanks, but no thanks on that bridge to nowhere.
Nearly everyone had heard of Alaska's infamous bridge to nowhere. It was a symbol of costly, wasteful government spending.
Believe it or not, in 2004, the US government earmarked about $223 million for a $400 million bridge that was supposed to connect Ketchikan, Alaska, and Gravina Island, home to, wait for it, a staggering 50 individuals. Obviously, this bridge was such a necessity that would serve so many people. I hope you can hear the sarcasm dripping in my tone. But that's not even where it gets bad. This is, while the whole business of building a bridge to nowhere was going on, this happened.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a test. There's a major hurricane that is in the Gulf of Mexico.
Now, you might expect that Congress would do the normal thing and divert the funds to a real emergency. Well, joke's on you, because they did not. As a matter of fact, the whole shebang became a huge embarrassment to Alaskans themselves. They practically started apologizing on behalf of the scoundrels they sent to Washington. Their words, not mine. Now, contrary to what you might expect, the government, in fact, did do something about it. They removed the earmark that same year, 2005. As Sarah Palin, governor of Alaska at the time, would tell you, she thought about the whole thing and then decided to kill the bridge and save taxpayers' money. In fact, she coined a cute little saying for it.
I told Congress thanks, but no thanks for that bridge to nowhere up in Alaska. If our state wanted a bridge, we were going to build it ourselves.
Well, if you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you to Brooklyn, because here's what actually happened. Yes, the bridge was killed, but no, taxpayers' money wasn't saved. The money actually went right back to Alaska. In fact, it went back to Gravina Island, specifically in the form of a road project. In other words, from a loud bridge to nowhere to a less loud road to nowhere. And that's not even an insult. I mean it. The road actually leads nowhere. The end of the road is nothing but muskeg and scrub forest that no one ever uses. It just curves around and then stops abruptly. But this didn't deter your government, so they went ahead and threw in a 700-foot-long tunnel underneath the Ketchikan airport to connect the airport terminal to the Gravina Island Highway, an additional $11 million, mind you. Meanwhile, in Congress, the men and women we employ and pay heavily to look after our best interests were still playing to build or not to build. In 2011, they resumed funding for this golden bridge. Then in 2015, they canceled it and said they were going to improve the ferry service instead. 11 years for America's finest to come to the realization that a town with 50 people and an active ferry service probably didn't need a $400 million bridge. Wow. But even this isn't as ridiculous as some of the expenses I'm going to talk about now, but it's going to be in rapid fire succession because I'm almost out of time, so sit tight. In 2020, good old Uncle Sam gifted struggling business owners with millions of dollars of forgivable loans in what was called the Paycheck Protection Program. I'm of course talking about people like Kanye West, whose business was already worth $2.9 billion at the time. Also in 2020, some Stanford scientists flushed $7 million worth of National Cancer Institute money down the toilet studying anal prints. Then we tried injecting beagles with cocaine just to see what that would look like. That cruel nonsense cost $2.3 million.
We found that they spent last year $2.3 million injecting beagles with cocaine.
We spent another $118,000 on a robot hand to see if it could snap its fingers like Thanos.
We spent $118,000 to study if a metal replica, a robot of Marvel Comics' evil warlord Thanos, could snap his fingers.
And let's not forget the $936,000 wasted to create a web-based TV series. Of course, while all that's happening, there's also Social Security fraud costing American taxpayers over $100 million yearly. The Federal Employees Health Benefits Program also makes sure to set $1 billion on fire each year by dashing out money to invalid members who are enrolled in the program. Then there are empty government buildings that cost us $1.7 billion to maintain every year. And the other day, we designed woodland camo uniforms for our military people in the Afghanistan desert for $28 million. Of course, we can't forget the pandemic fraud too, that's forced America to bleed nearly $2 billion of money we don't even have in the first place. You know when Spider-Man Uncle Ben told Peter Parker that with great power comes great responsibility? But I guess the US federal government's too cool to watch superhero movies. On Tuesday, April 16th, 2024, the IMF just had to call out the United States. Strangely, America's economy actually stood out Q1 2024, but the factors sponsoring that success were very sus. The IMF says that America's current fiscal policies are pretty much going to lead her to crash and burn in the long term, which I'm not sure many people would be too unhappy with if it happened. Anyway, what's especially worrying for them is that America's overspending could reignite inflation, as it has already done, make the country financially unstable, and then ultimately make funding more expensive for the rest of the world. I mean, the rate at which America's budget deficit is growing is alarming. By 2033, our public debt will likely hit $45.7 trillion, or 114% of our GDP. So we won't just be owing more than we can repay, our debt will officially outgrow our producing capacity, as at the end of 2023 we were already at 98% of our GDP. Yet federal agencies continue to make mistakes with our money that are so silly it has to be intentional. It's not enough that the government overspends on ludicrous projects, even the mandatory projects are carelessly managed as well. Fortunately, a few agencies are tightening their belts, and President Biden is also doing his bit, or at least he says he is. As part of his plans for the 2025 fiscal year, Biden and now Harris want to enforce tax reform so that the big corporations pay their fair share. They also want to cut out wasteful spending on big pharma and big oil, America's double-headed dragon. In fact, Biden already signed the first ever Medicare prescription drug negotiation program into law, which means that unlike before, big pharma won't just dictate their prices and then Medicare would run to do their bidding. Now, Medicare can negotiate on behalf of the average American to get prices as low as possible, which means the government spends less. If Harris manages to pull Biden's plan off, the projection is that we could reduce our budget deficit by about $3 trillion over the next 10 years. But honestly, it's like the IMF report suggests. The damage has already been done. The nation is already neck deep in a debilitating financial crisis.
The government just released a report on economic growth for the first quarter.
U.S. GDP grew at a slower than expected pace in the first quarter of this year.
The economy will be a big topic heading into 2024.
I mentioned earlier that America's economy performed well in Q1 of 2024. What I forgot to mention, though, is that the economy was too strong. And when you combine that with the federal deficit, federal debt, and low employment rate, it's really bad news for America, especially because of the two things I'm about to say next. The first has to do with the Fed and the federal government. You've heard the mantra before, don't fight the Fed. If you haven't, it's age-old investment advice that warns you not to make money moves that go against the Fed's policies because, in the end, you suffer. The federal government, however, does not seem to care about that. As close and as intertwined as the federal government is with the central bank, the two are never on the same page when it comes to spending or servicing the federal debt. To paint a picture, let me ask you a question. If you're a homeowner, what did you do during COVID-19 when the Fed cut interest rates to a record-breaking 0%? You locked in your mortgage rates, right? Because that's just what you do. But the federal government, for some strange reason, did not increase its long-term borrowing. And now the window has passed and the government has to be paying over 4.5% interest on its debt. By 2028, interest costs alone will overtake what we spend on defense. Defense! Mind you, we're already approaching the $1 trillion mark for Pentagon spending. When you add all of this to the absurd congressional expenses, it leads us to my second point. America is addicted to spending. It's second nature to us by now. It's our solution to everything. Whenever we're faced with any major financial crisis, we unleash stimulus packages. Think global financial crisis of 2008 and a COVID-19 pandemic. And it was easy for us to get hooked because it actually worked. For instance, after spending about 10% of our GDP on fiscal stimuli compared to the EU's 2%, our stock market stood out among the developed world. Plus, we made our mark in the global technological sector. Our rebound from the COVID-19 pandemic also wasn't shabby at all. While many countries were struggling to recuperate, we took the time to widen the gap between us and our peers some more. Unfortunately for us, someone forgot to tell Congress that these growths were artificial. Even in a financial crisis, throwing money at the problem isn't always the solution. All the growth we boasted was just juiced by ultra-low rates, and now the chickens are coming home to roost. While we were swelling up economically, the root of inflation was growing along with us, and now stopping it seems impossible. Obviously, there couldn't be a better time for the Fed and the federal government to work together and get America's fiscal house in order. But once again, never on the same page. The Fed is on one side trying to run down its balance sheet. The federal government is on the other side getting high as a kite on debt. What the federal government desperately needs right now is to at least try and balance its budget either by raising revenue or cutting spending. And I definitely know one good place they can start: the Pentagon. In fact, if the federal government doesn't begin here, then any effort it makes to balance the budget would be just as effective as pouring water into a basket. It's that serious. Watch this video next to learn why the Pentagon holds the key to America's economic prosperity. I'll be reading all your comments, and I'm already working on my next video, so if you have any feedback or tips, my ears are wide open. Make sure you subscribe, and thank you for watching.